Human beings run on a set of default psychological settings. You waste your free time, you measure your worth against the wrong metrics, you misinterpret your own successes, you fail to persuade the people around you, and you accidentally isolate yourself.
Yeah, and you look at your life and see these patterns repeating despite your absolute best intentions.
Right. So today, we are pulling together behavioral economics research, cognitive psychology frameworks, and operational design manuals to figure out exactly how to rewire those defaults.
Because a connecting thread here is that bypassing these generic traps requires granular operational tactics.
Exactly. We're not interested in platitudes like, work smarter or do not compare yourself to others.
No, we're here to break down the exact mechanics of how to override human default behaviors. The fundamental problem with phrases like "do not compare yourself" is that they sound comforting, but they offer absolutely zero instruction.
Right. I mean, your brain is a highly complex machine that runs on specific inputs and outputs.
Exactly. If you want to change an outcome, you have to engineer the specific physical steps that force a different result. You have to bypass the conscious, willpower-driven part of your brain and build a system that practically makes the right choice inevitable.
Because willpower isn't a strategy, right? It's a finite resource that just depletes throughout the day.
100%.
So before we can optimize how you evaluate your successes or pitch your ideas, we really have to fix the baseline of your daily energy. You cannot rewire your career or your relationships if you are losing like 5 hours a night to sheer paralysis.
Yeah. Let's look at the operational mechanics of the 5 to 10 o'clock evening drift.
Okay, let's unpack this. You finish work, you sit down, you open your laptop, and you waste an entire hour just deciding what to do.
And you have personal projects and goals, but the friction of choosing what to tackle is immense.
Totally. By 8 o'clock, you are inevitably watching television, and by 10 o'clock, the entire evening slot is completely gone.
Right. The psychological mechanism at play here is severe decision fatigue. Throughout the workday, your prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain responsible for executive functioning, planning, and impulse control, it's constantly firing.
I mean, every email you answer, every minor problem you solve, it burns a measurable amount of glucose and cognitive energy.
Exactly. So by the time 5 o'clock rolls around, that executive center is fundamentally depleted. You're asking a compromised, exhausted version of your brain to perform high-level strategic planning.
Which is obviously a recipe for failure. So the operational tactic to fix this is shifting the timeline of the decision, right?
Right. You write the evening or next day to-do list during the workday, specifically around 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
Wait, why 2 o'clock?
Because the 2 o'clock version of you still has professional momentum and realistic expectations. The 7 o'clock version of you just has to answer to the list. You remove the burden of choice entirely.
I can hear people listening to this right now thinking, that sounds great in a vacuum, but a typical workday is entirely chaotic.
Oh, absolutely.
My inbox might be on fire at 4:30. Priorities shift at the last minute. How does a strict 2 o'clock planning session survive in an environment where everything changes constantly? It feels like that list would be obsolete by the time you actually log off.
And that is exactly why the list must be strictly constrained. We are not talking about drafting a master project plan here.
Right.
To make this system work against that chaos, there are rigid operational rules. First, you are allowed a maximum of 1 to 3 items.
Just 1 to 3.
Yes, no more. Second, they must be strictly operational. You write, edit the first 10 minutes of the presentation, not, do podcast stuff.
I see. Because if the 7 o'clock version of you has to think about what the task actually requires, the system fails before you even begin.
Exactly. And the reason we do this at 2 o'clock is to establish a firewall. If a fire drill happens at 4:30, your executive brain is dealing with the fire drill. Your past self from 2 o'clock has already protected your evening priority.
That makes total sense.
Finally, the list must be visible right at 5 o'clock. It should be a sticky note physically attached to your monitor or the top of a document you leave open.
So at 5 o'clock, there is no deciding. There's no scrolling social media to decompress. There's no checking to see how you feel. You just execute the highly specific task, and you don't negotiate with your depleted brain.
Precisely. You execute, you don't negotiate.
So it's essentially like a relay race. The 2 o'clock runner is handing a highly specific aerodynamic baton to the 7 o'clock runner.
I love that analogy. Yes.
Because if the afternoon runner tries to hand over a massive, disorganized box of random thoughts and vague ambitions, the evening runner is simply going to drop it and walk off the track. The handoff must be absolutely seamless.
That is the perfect visualization. And once you master that seamless handoff, you start actually achieving those daily goals. You start accumulating wins.
But this introduces the next major psychological trap, doesn't it?
It does. The way our minds evaluate those wins is inherently flawed, which completely undermines the progress we just engineered.
Right. We try so hard to control our time to achieve these victories, but our minds drift into highly toxic territory when we actually secure them.
Let's look at a very common scenario.
Yeah, like you get a promotion at work, it's a real raise, a real title bump, and you walk out of the meeting feeling fantastic. You achieved exactly what you set out to do.
And then a colleague mentions in passing that they got promoted in the same cycle and walked away with a slightly bigger salary increase.
Instantly, the win you were celebrating turns into a devastating loss. But the standard advice here is always just to practice gratitude or, focus on your own journey. Why do those platitudes completely fail to stop the negative spiral?
What's fascinating here is that platitudes fail because they fight against deep evolutionary wiring. The brain doesn't measure what you have against what you actually need to survive or be comfortable.
Right.
It measures what you have against your reference circle. This is an ancient survival mechanism. Knowing your status in the immediate tribe dictated your access to resources.
And today, every single time you level up in your career or your life, your reference circle levels up with you.
Exactly. This is known in psychology as the hedonic treadmill.
Mhm.
You move to a nicer neighborhood, and suddenly your new neighbors have nicer cars.
You join an elite team at work, and suddenly you're surrounded by relentless high performers. The baseline is in a constant state of upward motion.
You can never out-earn or outperform the comparison gap because your brain will always seek out the next point of contrast.
Wait, if the gap never naturally closes because our neurological baseline keeps shifting, how do you operationally stop chasing it? If gratitude journals don't work, what is the physical mechanic to break the cycle?
You have to manually intervene in your own data collection. You must stop snooping.
Stop snooping.
Yes. When you're on the fifth refresh of a rival's social media page, or when you're subtly digging into a colleague's salary history, you have to recognize the impulse for what it is.
You aren't looking for actionable information. You're actively seeking a measurement against yourself.
Exactly. The operational tactic is to physically and digitally step out of the spaces that force the comparison. Mute the group chat that only exists to track career wins. Leave the networking hangouts where people just compare status.
Which sounds entirely logical until you realize that same group chat is often where your friends plan weekend dinners or share personal news.
True.
You're risking social isolation just to protect your ego. It feels like a very high price to pay just to stop feeling jealous.
Yeah, that's a valid concern, but it requires distinguishing between genuine connection and competitive data gathering. You don't have to cut people out of your life, but you must curate the specific channels of communication.
Oh, so if a specific digital space consistently triggers the comparison gap, you move the social interaction to a different medium.
Precisely. You text those friends individually to arrange dinner. You change the environment so you can maintain the relationship without constantly feeding your brain toxic comparative data.
Okay, so if we successfully cut off that toxic data and stop measuring ourselves against others, we're forced to properly evaluate our actual work.
And this brings us to another massive cognitive trap.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The default human behavior is treating an outcome as a final destination or a permanent judgment on our abilities. We treat the end result as a proxy for our own competence, which completely distorts our reality.
There's immense danger on both sides of the outcome spectrum. Let's look at the unexplained win first.
Right. So you launch a project, it goes incredibly well, and you immediately assume you have undeniable proof of your brilliance.
In reality, you are suffering from survivorship bias. You have one positive result and absolutely no idea which variable caused it. Was it your strategy, the timing, a competitor's mistake, or just sheer luck?
And because you won, you stop investigating. You assume you have proof, but you just have one result.
Exactly. Conversely, the overreacted loss is equally destructive. You ship a project that lands flat, and you immediately assume everything you did was wrong.
You throw out perfectly good elements just because they were in the room when the failure happened. You change the target audience, the structure, and the tone all at once.
You ruin the formula by assuming the entire system was broken.
So it's like throwing out your entire car just because the radio stops working. You assume the whole vehicle is defective when it's just one isolated wire.
Well, close, but a car is highly modular. Work is much more organic, more like chemistry. It's exactly like a scientific control group.
How so?
If a cake collapses in the oven, you don't throw away your entire kitchen. You don't buy a new stove, change the flour, reduce the sugar, and bake it at a completely different temperature all at once.
Because if you change 5 variables, you will never know what actually fixed the cake.
Exactly. You just change the baking powder. You isolate the single variable.
But isolating a variable in a pristine scientific lab is easy. In a corporate environment or in our personal lives where a dozen things go wrong at once, how do you realistically find the baking powder? What does that operational tactic actually look like?
You must run the exact same rigorous post-mortem, whether you are celebrating a massive victory or recovering from a humiliating defeat. You sit down and ask the exact same sharp questions.
Like what?
What specific action moved the result? What was merely environmental noise? What is the absolute smallest next thing to test?
So an unexplained win is mathematically just as useless as an unexplained loss, because neither provides you with a reproducible path forward.
Exactly. You have to train your brain to treat both success and failure strictly as neutral data points indicating where you are right now, not as permanent indictments of who you are.
Let's take this a step further. Once you've run those postmortems, isolated the variables, and developed a tested, successful idea, you eventually have to get other people on board.
Yes, you have to pitch your improvement.
And this is where we see incredibly competent people constantly fail. You walk into a room with a demonstrably better idea, you show the beautifully designed data outlining the benefits, and absolutely no one commits.
It happens all the time.
You leave the meeting completely baffled as to why people refuse to adopt a vastly superior system.
We have to examine the psychological context of decision-making here. People do not evaluate options in absolute terms.
Right, they don't look at a spreadsheet and automatically choose the most logically efficient path.
They evaluate options by comparing them against the familiar. The fundamental problem is that the current way of doing things is an abstract category deeply ingrained in their daily habits.
So if an idea is too new or too vastly different, the brain can't run a clean comparison.
And when the brain experiences that cognitive friction, it panics and defaults to the safety of the status quo. Change represents an expenditure of cognitive energy that the human brain actively wants to conserve.
We hear the phrase comparing apples to oranges all the time, usually as a reason why two things can't be evaluated together. But in a workplace, you're literally asking people to drop their familiar orange and buy into your completely unknown apple.
Exactly.
So how do you actually bypass that mental block when they inherently hate change?
You don't ask them to compare apples to oranges. You operationally paint your apple orange.
Maybe that orange. Okay.
Yes. You must pick one specific painful workflow your colleagues live inside every single week. You show the exact workflow under the old system, highlighting the specific friction they already hate.
Then you show the exact workflow under your new system. Same task, same inputs, entirely different and smoother path.
You force the comparison to happen entirely on their familiar territory. You do not pitch a brave new world. You pitch a highly specific bridge out of their current pain.
To make sure this is entirely clear, let's look at a granular example.
Sure.
If I want to pitch a completely new agenda structure for all company meetings, the absolute worst thing I can do is walk in and say, I have a new operational framework for our communication.
Oh, absolutely. That immediately sounds like a massive pile of extra administrative work to colleagues who are already overwhelmed. Their status quo bias will reject it instantly.
So I should pull up the actual shared calendar from the last 2 weeks, right?
Yes. You point to 3 specific, useless meetings that everyone in that room hated attending, which only happened because of vague, badly planned invites.
You remind them of the hours they lost.
Then, you show exactly how your new invite structure prevents those 3 specific meetings from ever happening again. You ground your completely new idea in their existing, highly specific frustration.
That is a brilliant transition into our final concept. If you master all of these operational tactics, if you rigidly manage your evenings, surgically filter your comparisons, scientifically analyze your data, and seamlessly persuade your colleagues, you become incredibly competent.
You become an absolute machine at executing your life.
But that extreme competence leads directly into the final, most insidious psychological trap. You get so good at handling things alone that you accidentally build impenetrable walls.
The addiction of hyper-independence creeps in incredibly slowly. At first, it feels like empowerment. You run an errand alone because it's faster.
Then you go to the dentist alone because you don't want to bother anyone. You handle a major career crisis alone because your operational systems are so strong.
You conquer a slow, lonely Sunday afternoon by yourself. Eventually, other people become entirely optional.
You stop asking for help, and without realizing it, you start treating every incoming request for connection as an operational interruption. Your efficiency becomes a barrier to your humanity.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, there are two distinct extremes you must actively navigate around. Trap 1 is collapsing back into needing company just to function.
Right, the loneliness route, where you abandon your hard-won capability and wait for other people's schedules to align before you can live your life.
Trap 2 is keeping the extreme capability but losing all your people. This is the wall route, where you dismiss every attempt at closeness because you technically don't need assistance to survive.
You confuse self-sufficiency with solitude, pushing away support because you view it as inefficiency. So what does the operational middle ground actually look like? If I've spent months building these rigid systems, how do I maintain my competence without isolating myself?
There are three specific mechanics you must implement. First, you must clearly define what is truly yours. Your career decisions, your money, your physical body, those belong entirely to you. You must recognize that most invitations from friends or family are not attacks on your carefully engineered autonomy. They are simply attempts at contact. They are trying to reach you, not control you.
That shifts the perspective entirely. Instead of seeing a text message asking to hang out as a threat to my meticulously planned evening, I can see it as a data point of connection. But what happens when I legitimately do need to protect my time? Like, how do I say no without building that wall?
That brings us to the second mechanic. You must carefully watch the specific phrasing of your decline. Language is an operational tool. Saying, "I can handle it," slams the door shut.
It tells the other person they're unnecessary and entirely redundant in your life.
Exactly. Saying, "I want to handle this one alone, but let's catch up on Friday," leaves the door wide open. You are protecting your boundary while simultaneously affirming the relationship.
And the third mechanic, what is the final step to actively prevent that isolation?
It's the counterintuitive move. You must intentionally say yes to things you could easily handle alone.
Wait, say yes to things I can do by myself.
Yes. Bring a friend along to a boring errand. Ask someone to join you for a routine medical appointment. Invite a colleague to review a project you already know how to finish.
Oh, so you must artificially open the door so your independence becomes a conscious, selective choice rather than a default setting that quietly deletes everyone from your life.
You have to engineer moments of reliance to keep your social muscles active.
We've just spent this time talking about highly engineered mechanical tactics to handle our evenings, our emotions, our pitches, and our friends. It raises a fascinating paradox. Does applying this level of precise operational engineering to our personal lives make us less human? Or is it exactly this kind of rigorous system design that finally buys us the mental freedom to actually be spontaneous, present, and deeply human when it truly matters?